You this one. South Africa is set to implement a new Employment Equity Act. It's mainly aimed at reducing the red tape for small businesses. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Tabea, Kabinde, Chairperson of the Employment Equity Commission. Ma'am, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. The new act or the changes in the Employment Equity Act are only set to kick in early next year. What are the key aspects that you are changing? What are these things that are going to be different come next year?
Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to your listeners. Basically, there are three issues that the amendment bill seeks to address. The first one is that based on our track record over the past years, over 20 years of looking at employment equity, we've seen a trend of very slow transformation, and it is as a result of the fact that mainly employers are self-regulating. And what we're seeking to do is to have the minister have the ability to set sector targets. So the amendment bill will enable the minister to set sector targets and expect employers to comply to the set sector targets. And that is the first thing that we're seeking to do with the amendment bill. The second thing that we're seeking to do is to promulgate Section 53 of the Employment Equity Act. This section has always been in the Employment Equity Act from its inception in 1999. And what Section 53 seeks to do is to ensure that businesses that are non-compliant with the Employment Equity Act cannot do business with government. So we want to ensure that those who are not respecting the laws of the land would not be able to benefit from doing business with government as well as with state-owned enterprises. And then finally, as you have said, we want to reduce the regulatory burden on smaller employers, meaning, if you remember that employers that are considered designated employers are designated based on two criteria. The first criteria is that they have employees that are 50 or more in number. And the second one is that they have a turnover that is stipulated in terms of the Act, where if their turnover is exceeding the threshold, then they are expected to report. So what we're doing now is to say smaller employers, irrespective of their turnover, any employer who has 49 and less employees will not have to report and comply with the requirements of reporting as per the Employment Equity Act. So yes, we are seeking to reduce the regulatory burden on smaller employers.
So in that particular case, the turnover will no longer be material, it just be on the number. That criteria is going to be specific to the number of employees below 50, then you don't have to report. Okay, let's talk about Section 53. What will be the consequences of not complying with the regulation of Section 53?
Well, first of all, what it means is that if you're not meeting the requirements of Section 53, you are considered a non-compliant employer. So what we need to remember is that in terms of the current legislation, if you're non-compliant, inspectors can come on your site and they can enforce employment, so compliance. So that is the first thing. But there is additional a carrot and a stick. So when you are compliant, what it enables you to do is to do business with government and to be able to get state tenders. So as part of the tendering process, businesses will be expected, in the same way that they produce a BEE certificate, they would also be required to produce an employment equity compliance certificate, which will be issued by the minister. And I need to emphasize that in terms of this compliance, we're not only looking at reporting. We're not looking at just employers reporting. We're looking at whether the employer is working towards the set targets. Is there progress, or are they achieving the sector targets as set by the minister? Secondly, we want to ensure that employers that have been found guilty of discrimination in their workspace by the CCMA or the Labour Court for that year in which they have received a finding of guilt they cannot do business with government. And finally, the third criteria will be employers that are not paying their employees minimum wage and do not have a justifiable reason or are not exempted from doing so would then not be able to do business with government. So a combination of all these factors I've mentioned.
Okay, one of the things that's going to change that's big, you've mentioned in the earlier, is about sectoral targets. The minister, this new act will allow the Minister of Labour to set sectoral targets. Will that be done top to bottom? Will that be done in consultation with the different sectors of our economy?
Yes, it will be done in consultation with the different sectors. You know, what the clause says is that the minister, in consultation with the different sectors and upon advice from the Commission for Employment Equity, will set sector targets.
Okay.
And
so
currently what we're doing is that we're consulting.
Yeah, Ms. Kabinde, consulting will happen. So currently you are busy consulting, you are saying? Are you busy going around the country consulting?
Yes, we already consulting with the different sectors. We have met all the sectors. We have proposed targets to the different sectors. And currently we're receiving inputs from the different sectors as to what they consider reasonable, or if they agree with our targets, then they accept and we finalize the findings around that.
This is specific to EE targets, nothing else.
Yes, specific to employment equity targets. That's right.
Yeah, one of the issues that keeps on cropping up recently when you issue your EE report is that corporate South Africa, for example, is battling to have black people and black women in the top echelons of executive echelons of management. You look at the numbers recently about what's happening at the JSE of the companies that are listed, South African companies on the JSE, very few. It's a small number of them, small number that are led by women CEOs, for example, let alone black women or black CEOs. So in setting these targets, will that be taken into account that we need to shift the needle in a visible way going forward?
Yes. So our targets, especially at the top two levels, which is top management and senior management, we set targets for in terms of race, in terms of gender, as well as in terms of disability. So those are the designated groups. Those are the benefactors of the Employment Equity Act. And we set targets for all three of those groups.
Okay. Did you mention people with disabilities?
Yes, I did. I mentioned people with disabilities. I mentioned women of all color, and I mentioned black people, which is African, colored, and Indian.
Okay. So how will those targets then juxtapose with the broader scorecard? Because all these companies, when they do report, the EE is just one element of the BEE scorecard that everybody is still busy with in terms of their transformation strategies.
It will indeed, and part of the work that we're doing is we are in consultation with the Commissioner for the BEE, Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Commissioner. We're in consultation and we're trying to align our legislation. But even currently, if you look at what is happening, when you look at the element of management control on the scorecard, it is actually based on employment equity performance. So it is based on where the organization is at in terms of its demographic representation.
Okay, finally, your sectoral consultations, have you concluded them? And I just remembered now that many of these sectors like financial services, mining sector, they have their existing standalone charters in terms of black economic empowerment, and that management control and ownership and stuff like that would form part. So are they trying to align as well with their sectoral charters as well? Are you, as the Employment Equity Commission, alive to that reality?
Yes, we are alive to that reality. And in fact, we use those charters as a baseline where we recognize that the targets that are set in the charter are realistic and meet our requirements. We most likely integrate that into the targets that we're setting. And we present that to the different sectors to say, this is what we want to see.
Okay, so your consultations are done and dusted now?
Almost. They're not concluded as yet. We have begun consultations with all sectors, but they're not concluded.
Okay. When do you expect to conclude? Because this act has to come into place, my understanding, in March next year?
We will be ready by March next year.
Okay.
It is a consultative process, so we're seeking to have employers really present their position on these.
Okay, we wish you well. Thank you very much, Ms. Tabea Kabinde. She's the chairperson of the Commission for Employment Equity.